Elderwood Academy are artisans who craft amazing gaming products, including dice towers, dice trays, dice boxes, deck boxes, dice, and more. All products are crafted to look like spellbooks, scroll cases, codexes, and other awesome fantasy gear. I'm a sucker for anything miniature, and Elderwood has miniature versions of their hex chest as well as teeny matching phoenix dice. Like their prodigious progenitors, Hex Chest Minis are crafted in a spectacular array of wood options, delicately appointed with engraved art and finished by hand. They offer a pleasing permutation of personalization, precision, and polish packed into a precious parcel prepared to portably protect your playthings. You can check out these small dice and dice boxes and all of the options they offer at elderwoodacademy.com/don't split.
This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm John. I am talking today with Steve Kenson. Steve is an incredibly prolific game designer, writer, and occasional novelist. After getting his start writing for RPGs in the 90s as a fan on Shadowrun, Steve has gone on to work on a slew of superhero RPGs, including writing for the original Aberrant, Silver Age Sentinels, creating Mutants and Masterminds, DC Adventures, and Icon superhero role-playing. He's also worked on or designed games including Crimson Skies, True 20, Blue Rose, Dragon Age, Fantasy Age and Modern Age, and even Pathfinder. He's a staff designer for Green Running Publishing and is a publisher of Neo-Pagan and New Age books through Copper Cauldron Publishing. His next projects are a lead designer for an updated version of Aberrant for Onyx Path and a 5e sourcebook for the Blue Rose setting for Green Running. Steve and I sat down to talk over Zoom on November 13th. I'm John, the Crossways GM, and welcome to Tabletop Babble. This afternoon, I am talking to, honestly, probably the person most responsible for my superhero role-playing game addiction. You have inadvertently contributed to lots of spending on my part on superhero role-playing games. Here we talk with Steve Kenson. Steve, how would you describe your role in the role-playing industry at this point?
I usually refer to myself as a designer these days. That basically just means I write games.
Well, and you've written a lot of games. I started searching through my various superhero role-playing games last night, and I don't know that if you would willingly wear the hat that you were probably the most prolific superhero role-playing game writer at this point. But you've been involved in the original Aberrant and the new Aberrant, Silver Age Sentinels, Mutants and Masterminds, Icons. What else am I missing on the superhero front?
I did some work for the old Marvel Superheroes Adventure game.
Oh, okay.
Back when TSR had it.
The card game, was that?
Yes, the saga-based card game.
And then...
and a couple of others.
And what are you working on now? I mean, what sort of things are you working on?
These days, it's pretty much splitting my time between doing design work for Green Running Publishing on pretty much all of Green Running's game lines, Mutants and Masterminds, the various age system games like Fantasy Age and Modern Age, Blue Rose, The Expanse, and doing my own work on Icons, superpowered role-playing for the most part. A little freelance here and there on projects like the new edition of Aberrant, which I did lead design on for Onyx Path. It is just released to the Kickstarter backers, but hasn't released in pre-orders yet, I don't think.
Yeah, just last night I went and signed up through Backer It to get the PDF of it. I haven't received it yet. The link didn't work yet, but I'm keeping my fingers crossed it'll be coming soon. I was a fan of Aberrant when it first came out, and again didn't realize until relatively recently your role involved in the Aberrant line. The question I've kind of set myself up for to ask everybody when I get them on here is, how did you get involved in tabletop role-playing games in the first place? What was your first experience, either playing or running, or I guess for some people just writing?
Well, I got involved playing RPGs in middle school. I stumbled across a copy of the original gray box of Gamma World, the first edition of Gamma World, in a local bookshop. I begged my parents to buy it for me, and pretty much like right after that, I digested it all and talked a couple of friends of mine into playing it with me. And that's pretty much what we spent the summer doing was we played every, and by every, I mean, there were like 3 Gamma World adventures at that point. We played them all. We made up a bunch of other stuff. And by the end of the summer, we had figured out that Dungeons and Dragons was related to Gamma World. And so we had run out of Gamma World things to do. So we had our Gamma World characters travel by dimensional rift to Greyhawk with their lasers and their mutant powers and tear up the hidden shrine of Tamakan, if I remember correctly. And that was pretty much all she wrote.
So from those beginnings, I mean, when did you get the idea that, hey, somebody actually writes this stuff and puts it together and came up with the way that the game works?
Well, I started going to conventions in my late teens, and by the time I was in college, I went to my first Gen Con when I was 18. And so by the time I was in college, I was already passingly acquainted with, the notion that there was a game industry and that there were actual real people who were making these games. And I had met, a number of them. And I was a big fan of Shadowrun when it had come out in '89. And that was like the mainstay of my college gaming group after that. It was Champions up until that point, and then Shadowrun came along and we were all about Shadowrun. And so when the second edition of Shadowrun was in playtest in the dark ages of the internet, when everybody was on dial-up, and FASA was cutting edge because they were conducting a lot of their fan groups and playtests on one of the early dial-up networks, the Genie network, which was owned and run by GE, General Electric, believe it or not, kids. And so I was a pretty active playtester at that point. I was probably kind of annoying because I was that guy. I was like full of suggestions, and so apparently my playtest feedback made a pretty decent impression because Tom Dowd, who was the Shadowrun developer at the time, had a hole in their schedule. He said, somebody dropped out of a thing. I need 1,000 words for the new edition of the Grimoire source book. He's like, you want to write them? And man, I don't think I ever worried so much over 1,000 words in my life, my college career, my writing career since. But I wrote it, sent in a draft. Tom liked it. And he was like, yeah, this is good, a sort of thing. And he was like, do you want to do some more? And I was like, yeah. I was super enthusiastic about the idea. And it started, it led to doing some fairly regular freelance gigs for Shadowrun for a while. And that progressed. I was doing more stuff for FASA. I got to write, I pitched and wrote a source book. It just sort of snowballed until I decided that I really, really hated my day job working as a corporate marketing guy for a tech startup. And I was like, I really want to do this. So I did the thing they tell you not to do, and I quit my day job. And I was like, I'm going to make a go at, writing games.
Was there any looking back at that point? I know I went to a panel discussion at Gen Con years ago when I was still working for newspapers, and I asked the question, can you make a living? I mean, I'm making a living as a newspaper editor. Can I make a living as an RPG writer? And everybody on the panel said no. They said stick with newspaper editing, which compared to the joys and fortunes to be made in newspaper editing, that didn't seem like a ringing endorsement. But I mean, it seems to have taken off for you. I mean, did you ever look back, and was it ever painful to make that choice?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there were definitely some hard times. If I knew then what I know now, I would have done it differently. I was young and, I wanted to make a go at this. But, I would have planned a lot better. I would have prepared a lot better. I honestly to be frank, probably wouldn't have gotten screwed out of money on a couple of occasions in terms of picking my jobs a little better. But but I made it through. But yeah, it's hard to make a full-time living especially in the tabletop industry, because it's such a cottage industry to begin with. I do okay, but I also self-publish and run my own imprint. I'm fortunate enough to have a pretty much regular contract gig with a publisher that I know and love. And even then, I'm by no stretch of the imagination in any danger of having my tax bracket go up anytime soon.
Not going to be the multimillionaire out of it. No.
The running joke of how you make a small fortune in the game industry holds true. You need to start with a large fortune.
And that's how you end up with a small fortune.
Small one.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I understand.
Yeah.
So I understand that the Shadowrun work also branched off into some novels you wrote. What was that process like?
That was interesting. I got my first novel contract after working freelancing on Shadowrun for a couple of years. The same way I pitched a proposal, it got accepted. And that was a very different process. For me, narrative writing is very different from game writing. Game writing is creative, to be sure, but has a much more technical side to it in a lot of regards, and has a little bit more of a, not journalistic, but more of a travel log in some ways, kind of a element to it. Whereas narrative writing is a whole different animal. And I did a number of Shadowrun novels, one MechWarrior novel, and a couple of, technically I wrote 2 books for Crimson Skies, but only one was ever published. And that was a very different experience in that regard. It was good, and I'm glad I did it. But I have to admit that I haven't written a lot of fiction since, and I haven't had a huge drive to.
Well, it kind of leads into world building, which you seem to have been a master of this. You really, especially with the Freedom City, I know that has been for me as a fan, it's been really interesting to watch the world develop and grow and change. I mean, it is not a static city that you just put out 3 different source books for.
Mm-hmm.
It is a city that has continued to advance and move through the timeline, characters growing up. Did you know when you first came up with these threads of an idea that this was going to grow into something that was going to be this organic and long lasting?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, honestly, Freedom City was a bit of a fluke in that it was a project that I designed freelance. The plans to publish it fell through. I ended up working on it in my own time, just as a pet project, because it was fun and I liked the setting a lot. And I ended up, designing Mutants and Masterminds basically in order to get Freedom City published through Green Ronin. And initially, we had no idea when it was first being published it was going to fly at all. We didn't know if people were going to be interested in a D20 superhero game. We didn't have any idea if people were going to be interested in the setting. So it was totally guesswork as far as that went. I was just grateful to get the book published at that point. And honestly, the fact that it's still around is still kind of blows my mind.
So the growth of the characters and the aging of the characters through the various source books. Can we talk a little bit about some of the themes that you were able to explore and to bring to life these characters after working on them for, it's almost 20 years now.
Yeah, just about. Yeah, I mean, that was another one of those things that we just sort of stumbled into, really, when it turned out that Mutants and Masterminds did do well, and there was clearly interest. Green Ronin brought me on board as developer for the game in order to make it a full-fledged game line. Originally, the folks there was a game studio called Super Unicorn who did the development and design, essentially the graphic design of the original edition in Freedom City. And the original notion was that they were going to basically be handling development, but the Super Unicorn guys basically ended up as part of the core of Paizo Publishing And then it was, oh, Paizo's publishing Dragon and Dungeon, and they're not going to have time to, run a RPG line. So it became Green Ronin needed a developer. They hired me. And we decided basically that since this was a real thing, we were going to look at doing a proper second edition, clean up a bunch of things, and plan out a game line basically right from the get-go. And one of the things that we talked about, because we were going to do a new edition of Freedom City, was the notion of, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, however, it was 3-4 years between editions, we were like, why don't we just say that's how much time has gone by, and we'll advance things a little bit, change things up a little, add a few characters, and look at, how things are in this span of time. But in hindsight, we didn't necessarily think about the fact that doing that clearly established a precedent. And that became pretty much the way it was, for Freedom City after that point. So the world just continued to advance. And that was actually what I was used to in terms of settings, because what FASA did with Shadowrun and with their BattleTech setting, there was always this continual sort of advancement of the timeline. So it was familiar to me as a concept. And we just continued to reflect that when we did new Freedom City or Earth Prime material in source books. It would be that amount of time has passed, and we would look at how the different setting developed. And yeah, it made for some interesting kind of advancements in things. The setting started out with a lot of legacy characters, and we got to do some actual passing of the mantle legacy characters over the course of the setting's publication, where some characters just were replaced by their younger successors and the like. Team compositions changed up, elements of the setting changed and evolved. When we developed Emerald City, that was a whole big expansion of the setting and a big shift in things. So it definitely was an opportunity to see characters grow and develop in a lot of ways.
So, as a fan reading through the various materials and watching it evolve, one thing that struck me, and it really, more so than a lot of superhero settings, certainly when I was growing up, where everybody was the same basic cookie cutter, white professional male who changes into a superhero in a phone booth or in a bat cave and then goes out and fights crime. A lot of the characters are from a lot of the spectrum of humanity. I mean, it is not just people who are what would have been in the 1980s or 70s or 60s the traditional superhero.
I'm glad it gives that impression. Honestly, I feel in retrospect that a lot of the setting could be more diverse, but I'm still basically a middle-class white guy, when it comes to a lot of that. So I certainly did try to make Freedom City and Earth Prime a more diverse setting. Particularly, I made a point to include an out gay character, because that's an area of inclusion that's particularly important to me. When developer Crystal Fraser came on, she added our first trans character to the setting, which I'm really glad she was able to do. So I mean, we do have a good range of representation. I feel in some ways it could be better, but I think that's an ongoing project.
Well, as a kid, what sort of comic books were you into? Was that something that you did? I assume you were a fan, but I'm just guessing here.
Oh, I was a comic book fan before I was a gamer, actually. Sure. I discovered comics when I was about 10, and my family moved around a lot. My dad worked for the VA. So I used to think when I was in elementary school that what kids did in the summers in between school years was pack up their house and move, because that's basically what my family did. And so when I was 10, the summer I turned 10, I basically spent it in a motel, my parents and my younger brother and our dog, while my parents were house hunting. And tiny roadside motel, 10-year-old, my parents would occasionally give me some money, send me across the street to the convenience store in order to, buy a snack and a couple of comic books to keep me quiet for an hour. And so I started a small collection of comics. I would basically be over there every week, buying all the week's new comics. And after that, basically, I discovered that comic book stores were a thing. And there was actually a whole store where you could go and buy comics, and not just the current ones, but all the back issues. And that was pretty much, it was just all over from that point. I started hunting through back issues and collecting comics.
Well, it seems like each of the superhero lines, at least that I'm familiar with, that you've been working on, each has a different flavor, almost like a sample of different eras of comic bookdom. Like Aberrant seems very Iron Age to me, very gritty. Icons seems very 80s Marvel sort of a tone to the, maybe because of any influences from Marvel superheroes. Silver Age Sentinels, I would have loved to see how that grew if it had kept going longer. And obviously, to me, the whole Freedom City world seems very DC-like to me. And you got to work on DC. What was that like, being able to actually make some official stats for some of those characters, for all those characters?
That was fun. I remember when we were first starting the DC project, John Lighthouser, who was the M&M developer at the time, and I sat down over a conference call, basically, and we took a giant spreadsheet, essentially, and we were like, okay, we're going to compile every DC character that we could possibly include in this, because it was a 4-book set. We knew that from the get-go, basically. And we were like, okay, what characters absolutely have to appear in the core rulebook? What characters are going to appear in the 2 Heroes and Villains books? And what characters are kind of tertiary enough and associated with sort of setting stuff that we can put them in the setting book. And we had to compile this whole list and then winnow it down and say, okay, how much space do we have? Who's getting a 1 page? Who's getting 2 pages? Who's getting 4 pages? And it was pretty much figuring out how much space each character could take up and what power level they were. And we were just pegging, sort of generally, like just to get a sense of where everybody fell. And that was a fun afternoon, I gotta say. It was challenging because we were like, oh, we gotta make some cuts, but we in the end packed a lot of characters into those books.
Well, and I thought it was an interesting test for how robust the Mutants and Mastermind 3rd edition was going to be, that you were able to create all those characters with the rules in front of you. It didn't look like you had to do a whole lot of, we got to come up with this power set. It seemed like everything sort of fit. You were able to make everybody work within the rules you'd already put together.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, any superhero game worth, the name is going to be designed with those characters in mind, because DC and Marvel superheroes are pretty much the core. So if your superhero game can't do, those characters, then it's not a particularly good superhero game.
So for the new Aberrant book, not having had a chance to take a look at it yet, how does it differ from the 99, 98 version? Did you adjust the timeline, I guess?
We did. The new book, the new edition of Aberrant is, for lack of a better term, inspired by the original edition, but is not a continuation of the original edition. When Onyx Path did a complete relaunch of the whole Trinity Continuum property, essentially, they redesigned everything from the ground up. And that includes the story path system and the setting. So there are certainly elements, in fact, a lot of elements of the original settings there, but some of them are remixed or reinterpreted in different ways. We definitely did move the timeline up because the original edition of Aberrant was set in the distant future of 2 years ago. And so we did need to bump things up in terms of that to set Aberrant in the near future. And a lot of it was the fact that it's not the 90s anymore. And a lot of the themes of the original Aberrant were honestly really very 90s. So the new interpretation of Aberrant is both, I think, a little more hopeful in some regards, a bit less cynical, but still presents a lot of the complex ideas that the original edition did in terms of the notions of power and how people exercise it when they have it or don't, as the case may be. And that's still the big underlying theme. But I think that you'll find that there's a lot more people with genuinely good intentions in Aberrant than people with genuinely bad intentions, even if sometimes those genuinely good intentions don't necessarily result in good ends.
And I assume that some of the landmark characters, the milestone characters, had been reinvented in this version.
Yeah, to a certain degree. Some of them are fairly like their original interpretations. I don't think, for example, that Divis Mal changed all that much, apart from having a lot more depth and nuance right from the get-go, because we basically know his whole history as far as that goes, rather than in Aberrant, he was much more of a cipher and a lot of his background wasn't known. Whereas in the new edition, in the secrets chapter in the back, it basically just tells you his whole his.
I'll be flipping right to that. I can tell you right now. The themes of Aberrant in the 90s, as you mentioned, were pretty dark, but honestly, they weren't that far off of reality when you look at the themes of the media and celebrity and corruption of the elites. And honestly, it doesn't seem like it was too far off of where we were headed at the time. And some of the tone of it seems awfully real today, unfortunately. When you are sitting down with project and you're setting that tone and setting the themes you're going to weave into it, how does that process work for you?
Well, I think it's, starting with a particular vision or a particular sense of where you want to go, a destination, essentially, how do you want to get there? And then looking at how do you get there? And for Aberrant, I knew that I wanted something that focused on the core concept of power and what you do with it, and basically how that affects you and how that changes you as a person, but also to widen the setting so that it had more ways we could approach that question, so that it wasn't just a simple. The original edition of Aberrant tended to be a bit black and white sometimes in terms of how it approached that question. Basically, everyone in authority was untrustworthy, and your job basically as someone who was powerful was to rebel against authority in some fashion. And instead, the new edition of Aberrant looks at the notion of, well, some people in authority are untrustworthy, and sometimes you need authority to get things done. So how do you work with that? Can you work with that? How much are you willing to compromise? How much can an incredibly powerful individual fit into that kind of structure? And to explore a lot of those things, as well as things like making the Terrigen faction more playable.
This episode is brought to you by Hero Forge. Hero Forge offers fully customizable tabletop miniatures with dozens of fantasy races and thousands of parts to choose from. Their easy-to-use design tool lets you build your perfect miniature online using a fully 3D, in-depth character creator right in your web browser. Custom minis can be made in a variety of materials, including plastic and metal options. They also offer downloadable model files so you can 3D print your own unique designs at home. Hero Forge is constantly expanding their catalog of customization options, adding new parts every week and major features like races and custom posing on a regular basis. Visit HeroForge.com to start designing your custom miniature today. And check back often, new content is added every week.
The idea of theme and tone, looking at Blue Rose, and I know there's a new Blue Rose take coming out again soon. Can we talk a little bit about what your thought was when that was first being put together, and the sort of game and how it was going to be different from standard hack and slash D&D, but still using a version of the D20 rules?
Well, Blue Rose was an example of working with a specific genre or subgenre in this case, where we were trying to emulate a particular style of fantasy, and one that was particularly focused on relationships, on character growth, and on basically the notion of the characters as essentially protectors of what is good in the world. And that, to a certain degree, runs, if not counter, differently from the notion of characters as sort of the fierce, tomb-robbing adventurer types. And it's definitely much more centralized. It's more home-based, and it is much more focused on the notion that the characters have this network of connections and relationships, as opposed to being nameless orphans, who are out on their own and simply doing whatever they want. So initially, it was a lot about emphasizing that in the text of the game, in terms of the background and the setting and the roles the characters would assume. We got more into adding some of that mechanically in the Age edition of Blue Rose as well.
I haven't tinkered with the Age edition of any of the Age line at this point, so I'm a complete neophyte on this. But can we talk a little bit about how Age came about and how it's grown? And are we looking at an Age edition of Mutants and Masterminds somewhere down the road?
Probably not, just because Mutants and Masterminds is its own thing, and the Age system and Mutants and Masterminds are both rules engines, essentially. In and of themselves, neither one of them is a setting. They're just both game systems. Could there be an Age system designed, or an expansion of the Age system designed to handle superheroes? Sure, there could be, but honestly, Green Ronin has been somewhat reluctant to dive into that, given the fact that Mutants and Masterminds exists and is still being published. So superpowers in the Age system has tended to focus much more on sort of the low end kind of what the game refers to as extraordinary abilities that are much better suited to sort of epic fantasy characters or sort of weird science modern characters and things like that, rather than comic book superheroes per se. The Age system, or Adventure Game Engine, basically was originally designed by Chris Pramas as the core game system for a licensed Dragon Age role-playing game based on the video games. We worked with BioWare, and the Dragon Age team at BioWare are all old school gamers, and they loved the idea of a licensed tabletop game version of the setting. And so Chris designed the Age system, very sort of old school inspired. It was very much sort of Chris's idea of what a sort of modern red box D&D would look like in a lot of ways.
Well, and so that even came. I'm sorry, that was even down to doing the box sets that that looked very, very much like Basic and Expert and so on and so forth, Companion edition.
Yeah, very much so. And so it's at the core a very simple, straightforward system of 3d6 rolls modified by the character's abilities versus a difficulty to determine outcomes. The interesting twist in the Age system is if any two of the three dice match, then what we call the stunt die essentially gives you a number of points on that action that you can use to enhance it in some way. And that's where we get the stunt system that has expanded from the initial just sort of cool combat tricks and magic things you can do, to applying the stunt system to all kinds of stuff, from exploration to role playing to now in the Expanse to starship combat.
So adapting Blue Rose to that system, how hard was it? How easy was it? Did it just slot right in?
It was pretty straightforward for the most part. The most involved things were adapting the Arcana system in Blue Rose, because Blue Rose had a particular system or a particular approach to magic. And so we basically built up its own magic system that was based on the stuff in the original edition of Blue Rose, as well as in Fantasy Age, the Age system fantasy engine. And it was also building up the role-playing stunts in particular, and also building up a system that of relationships. As I said, we ended up building some mechanical heft into the notion of character relationships, and essentially gave relationships their own sort of numerical rating to basically define how strong or important they were, and used the stunt system essentially to make that relationship a source of stunt points for the character, essentially for doing things that were important to that relationship, whether it was helping your one true love, or it was fighting your most hated enemy, or fulfilling your duty to your family. There were certain relationships that would essentially give the characters a resource they could draw upon when it came to doing things they needed to do.
So for the new version, as I understand it, is a 5th edition compatible version. What has that been like, trying to go full circle, I guess, on the concept?
That's been interesting. The main notion that I approached Blue Rose Adventurer's Guide, which is the 5th edition compatible version, was the notion of Aldia, the setting of Blue Rose, as a 5th edition setting. Basically, if this world was a part of the great multiverse of worlds, how would it best fit into that sort of canon? And so the notion was to try and make it as compatible with 5th edition sort of standards as possible. And rather than go in the direction of, we're going to design a 5th edition sort of inspired game with its own classes and its own everything, we're going to stick to the player's handbook as close as we possibly can, just add in the ancestries and the specific, very setting specific things we need, and look at the rest as sort of interpretation of, well, yes, all of these classes exist on Aldia, but what do they look like there? And how are they different, and how are they interpreted? And so I think that what we came up with is such that there's interesting new 5e subclasses and ancestries and other material that's new in the book, but at the same time, especially because we know that planar travel exists on Aldia to one degree or another, or at least it did, it would be perfectly possible for characters from another 5e setting to go there. And in fact, we even talk about that as a campaign starter if you wanted, and still be fit in mechanically in terms of how the setting works.
So 5e to me has always felt a little thin on the social skill side. Did you find that at all when you were working and moving the Blue Rose Adventurer's Guide to that system?
Yeah, in the sense that 5e largely tends to put most of the sort of weight of that onto role-playing rather than mechanics. And that's an approach, and a perfectly valid one, in my opinion. We did talk about, again, the setting importance of a lot of Blue Rose's themes. And we did talk about some mechanical elements, particularly inspiration, which is a really useful mechanic in 5e, and how that can play a role in the characters' relationships so far as it goes. But we cleaved pretty close to the way 5e handles it. And that's, like I said, that's a valid design choice. It's challenging, especially when dealing with relationships and with characters' thoughts and feelings, to mechanize them. Conversely, having worked on StoryPath for Aberrant and Trinity Continuum, that's a system that does mechanize those things. And you can have an emotional conflict with another character where the die rolls are going to dictate how your character feels ultimately. And that's something that some people find convincing and other people find confining.
Back in the original version of Aberrant, having a mega charisma character seemed like a lot of fun for me, because most of the other people are like making combat tanks that can soak, X amount of shells from a tank. And here you have the mega charisma character who can talk anybody into anything. Is that sort of carry over into the new Aberrant, or?
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
Very much. There's definitely a lot. I mean, because the system looks at the whole different sort of fields and areas of influence and ways you can do things. If anything, it actually has more mechanical support for characters who are mega social or mega mental in terms of their ability to create real game system resources for themselves. Because you can use your mega social abilities to create relationships in the game, for example, and those have mechanical definitions, and you can use those relationships to gain benefits. So that sort of thing has a very clear system to it. And one of the things we definitely played around with in the Trinity Continuum edition of Aberrant is the Onyx Path wanted to make a very clear separation between the psionic powers of the scions in Aeon and the quantum powers of the novas in Aberrant. So novas in Aberrant don't have mental powers as such. They have a lot of powers that seem like mental powers, but there's a distinct sort of in-setting difference between them and how they work. But one of the implications we talk about in the setting is that characters who are mega charismatic don't have a big like sign on them that says my superpower is mega charisma. They just have this weird thing where everybody likes them and does what they say, and to the point where, at least for the Nova, it might start to get kind of spooky. But it's really hard for the average person to say, you are using super mind control on me, aren't you? Because it doesn't come off that way. It's, well, why wouldn't I want to do what he wants? He seems super reasonable and he's such a great guy. And that's honestly the super scary thing about mega social characters, is oftentimes some of them don't even know they're doing it.
Just accidentally bending people to your will. There have to be projects, and I've found various remnants of projects, pieces of online that you had worked on, and then the line died or what have you. Is there anything that you really would have loved to, or would really still love to turn into something that could actually see print? And anything you really would like to bring to life at some point?
I have to say I have a pretty good record with my dream projects, and my sort of forlorn folder of discarded projects is not too bad so far as it goes. I would have liked to have worked a little bit more on this is God's like 2 or 3 versions back now, the Last Unicorn edition of Star Trek. I wrote a bunch of stuff for them. It was a fun game to work on. It would have been nice to have worked on a little more of that.
Any thoughts on the, I'm sure I'm going to pronounce the name wrong, Modiphius, the 2D20 version of Star Trek? I just picked it up a little while ago.
I have to admit, I'm only passingly familiar with it. I have the core book, and I have skimmed through it. I haven't honestly read it in great detail. Looks good. It's a nice looking game. I certainly like a lot of the stuff they're doing, just on the site, in terms of the projects, the products that are coming out for it look good. But unfortunately, it's one of those things that I haven't had the time to play or delve into all that deeply. Now that I'm on a bit of a Star Trek kick with Discovery season 3 out and Lower Decks, and CBS is doing
Picard.
right. I was going to say, and CBS is doing a new Star Trek series every other month.
Sure seems like it.
I might get on more of enough of a Star Trek kick to actually explore it more deeply.
Do you find time to actually play a lot? Is it something that you get to do, or is it
Um,
all work at this point?
Depends on your definition of a lot. I do still play. My regular gaming group meets monthly. We transitioned to Zoom during the pandemic, and we've been meeting and playing online. We just finished up a Mutants and Masterminds game, and I just wrapped running Tyranny of Dragons for my group. So we just started up a Starfinder campaign, which is pretty fun. And I've been playing a game every other week with my coworkers at Green Ravine.
Yeah, the Zoom gaming is it's taken me some getting used to, but the pandemic killed, I would say, 3 of my 4 gaming groups, and someday we may get back together again. Who knows at this point? On a personal level, this is just fishing at this point. But my son, when he was in middle school, had a brief period where he thought he was going to be a football player. And you're saying, where is he going with this? I had to sit in the parking lot and wait for him while he was playing football. And one of my distinct memories of this was I had just gotten the PDF of Mutants and Masterminds 3rd edition, or it could have been the DC Adventures game, and and I read it over the course of many hot practices sitting in the parking lot. My son has since gone on to graduate high school, and he has since gone on to be a full functioning adult, and it is still 3rd edition Mutants and Masterminds. Is there a new edition in the works? Are you happy with where it is now, and it's going to go forward the way it is?
Well, that's not my call. Ultimately,
Sure.
That's Green Ravine's decision, and up to Crystal Frazier, who's the M&M developer, as far as that goes. I know that. Well, I know, like every developer, Crystal has things that she would like to do with the system, and where we're going to best implement that, I don't know. As far as there being a new edition, there aren't any plans right now because, frankly, it's a little difficult to plan in general. And Green Ravine's publishing schedule is kind of stretched out, because of the inability to print and ship books for a number of months. A lot of projects have been reshuffled and rescheduled. And a lot of the things that are going to come out over the course of next year really are basically things that in one form or another were planned for this year. So there's still ways out in terms of deciding, what the future of any major game line is going to be. So, and I know that, Green Ravine has a number of good-sized projects that were planned for this year that aren't done yet. So because of circumstances. So I think it's probably going to be a while before anybody's looking at working on a new edition of anything.
Well, and you're able to keep your the creative juices flowing in the superhero world with Icons. Anything that people should be looking out for coming up in Icons?
Well, because Icons is basically my pet project, and it's all self-published and it's all print on demand and electronic. I am both blessed and have to work with the fact that I don't need to schedule anything for Icons. Icons gets done when I work on it, and products come out when they're done. So because I don't have to send things through distribution, I don't really have to, plan out or do I have to hit this deadline to get this product out at this time so that, it can, go through its, ad campaign and, yada, yada. I just do the thing and, I hit print, or whatever you publish on Drive-Thru-RPG. So which is my long-winded way of saying that there isn't anything definite. I've always got a bunch of Icons products kind of off in the wings that I work on in my spare time. And it's really just a matter of which one hits the finish line first. but I have a few thoughts. I'd like to do a few more short, sort of eclectic things for icons, more like zine-like as far as their content, and some more adventures, because I think adventure support is a key thing for a game.
The life of a freelance RPG writer. What does your work week look like? How do you divvy up your time on the various projects that are going on out there?
There's a fair amount of juggling. It basically breaks down to doing my email and my messages and my correspondence and checking in on Slack and all my various communications channels in the morning, seeing if there's anything that basically needs my immediate attention or things that need to be scheduled or whatnot. I try and get a fair amount of writing done in the morning because I find I'm more productive first thing in the day, and the more I can get done early, the less pressure I'm under later in the day. Oftentimes afternoon gets taken up by meetings or phone calls or interviews or what have you. So I schedule in some time for that. And, it'll tend to be more of a cool down kind of period in terms of work. I'll tend to write in the morning and edit in the afternoon, or revise in the afternoon, for example. And, we'll handle, more just sort of, writing emails to people and handling messages and those kinds of things so far as it goes. And beyond that, it depends on the balance of work, contract work I'm doing for Green Renine, freelance work I'm doing for another client, or personal work I'm doing for usually icons, or if I'm writing something for my blog or something of that sort. And I also manage a metaphysical publishing imprint with my partner. And I basically do a lot of the business management and the book layout and design stuff, publishing stuff for that. So I devote a few hours a week to that as well.
Lots of juggling.
Yeah, it's a lot of juggling. Google Calendar is my life. My to-do app is vital because if I don't have a to-do list, I'm just lost.
As we wrap up, obviously we have talked about Aberrant and the new edition that went through the Kickstarter, and you can, at least as I'm saying this in mid-November, not sure exactly what day we're posting it, can still get on Backer.it and get on board. The 5th edition version of Blue Rose, the adventure guide. Yeah. How do you go about getting on board with that?
It's on pre-order at greenreninestore.com right now. We're probably expecting an electronic release in probably by end of November.
Any other projects you want to let people know about if they want to follow your work and stuff that's coming out next?
Let's see, that's the big stuff. I've got a couple of other small Blue Rose things in the works. There's a Blue Rose adventure that's probably coming out this month, and a couple of small Mutants and Masterminds things. I've got a number of the entries in the ongoing Danger Zones series for locations for Mutants and Masterminds that's been coming out these past few months, but I don't know exactly what order those are releasing in. So I'm not sure exactly which one is coming up next.
Well, I haven't taken any look at any of those since they've come out. I apparently need to go make sure that my drive-through RPG store is ready to accept some money.
They're a pretty terrific resource, so I recommend them.
Well, we've been talking with Steve Kenson. Again, Steve is a game designer and writer of just a whole ton of stuff. We didn't even touch on Pathfinder and some of the other stuff I guess you've been involved in. Steve, thanks for chatting with us here on Tabletop Babble.
John, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards. You can find me on Twitter at Rocket Orca, Kenny as at Wolfmere, and John is at Crossways GM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to Geekspective.com to check out all our other shows or follow us on Twitter at Geekspective. This episode is brought to you by Kobold Press and Tome of Beasts 2, now available on the Kobold Press store. The publisher of the original smash hit Tome of Beasts, Kobold Press wrangled a new horde of wildly original, often lethal, and highly entertaining 5e compatible monsters to challenge new players and veterans alike. The Tome of Beasts 2 will bring 400 new monsters to 5th edition, from angelic enforcers, Sasquatch and Shriekbats, to psychic vampires, zombie dragons, and so much more. In addition to the Tome of Beasts 2 hardcover volume and PDFs, you can get monster pawns, VTT versions, and monster layers with beautiful maps. It also includes the work of Don't Split the Podcast Network's Celeste Konowich and James Introcaso. Find out more on koboldpress.com.